Crimes became punishable in the 15th century. Burglary, kidnapping, and treason were the most common crimes. Criminals were usually uneducated, poor, and unemployed. Thieves most commonly would go into people's houses while they were asleep. Kidnappers would kidnap kids and force them back to their homeland and make the kids work for them. Treason is when somebody betrayed their kingdom. Treason was the most common out of the three. Crimes, including working on a Sunday, playing soccer, and vagrancy, were crimes that are no longer crimes today. Working on a Sunday became illegal because Sunday became a weekly holiday. Playing soccer was basically like fighting a war. Vagrancy means that it was illegal to be homeless or poor. Along with these crimes, there were many criminals. William Serd Slipper was arrested for night walking while armed. John Lafayette was accused for suspicions over his wealth, and 6 years after the accusations, he fled his house and stole pigs. John Mousefort was hung for murder and burglary. After they were arrested for the crimes they committed, they were sent to prisons.
Prisons during medieval times were different than today's prisons. Buildings were first being developed specifically for the use of a prison in the 12th century. These first few prisons were used mainly to hold debtors, which are people who owe money. In the 14th century, prisons started to hold people for crimes other than debt. Conditions in medieval prisons really depended on the amount of money you had, because during the Middle Ages you had to pay for everything in prison: food, water, clothes, blankets, literally everything needed for survival. So for the wealthy who could buy whatever they wanted, prison stays could actually be comfortable. But for the poor who could afford very little, often died of starvation. The purpose of these medieval prisons was not to hold a criminal as the punishment for the crime they committed, like prisons today. The purpose was to just hold people until the time of their trial. Inside the prison was much more laid back than today. Prisoners could roam around the prison freely, and visitors were allowed whenever. So prisons weren't the punishment. After the trial is where that came in. Their fate was decided by the court. Very rarely did a criminal go back to prison as their punishment. Depending on the crime committed and the social status of the criminal, many were publicly humiliated, tortured, or executed.
In medieval times, when prisoners were tortured and executed, it was seen as a legitimate way to get confessions or more information about the crimes. There were many different methods of execution and would vary on the prisoner's social status. Executioners used multiple methods if someone had committed treason or murder. Some of the worst execution methods were quartering, decapitation, hung, drawn, and quartered, sawing, and flaying. Quartering is when a person's limbs are tied to 4 different horses, and as they move away, the prisoner's limbs are torn from their body. Decapitation was slow and painful because it would take multiple blows from an axe or sword for the prisoner to be beheaded. Hung, drawn, and quartered is when a prisoner was hanged until they were half dead, taken down and quartered alive, then their bowels would be cut from their bodies, and finally they were decapitated. Sawing would be when a prisoner was hung upside down and sawed in half. When a prisoner was flayed, they would be tied down and skinned alive. It would take a couple of days for them to die from dehydration after that. Most crimes that prisoners were executed for are no longer crimes today.
Torture was a common form of punishment in the Middle Ages. Even some of the smallest acts could be found as a crime and result in horrible consequences. One of the most common forms of torture was dislocation. There were many ways to inflict it on criminals, such as the pair of anguish and also the stretching rack. The pair of anguish was used either to dislocate jaws or was inserted into the anus or vagina to cause pain. The pair was used on homosexuals, blasphemers, and women who had experienced a miscarriage.
Crushing the maxilla and zygomatic, thrusting the bones into the brain, killing the victim.
That is one horrible way to die.
The rack was used by strapping the arms and legs of a victim to the table and using a crank to stretch the ropes attached to them, causing the arms and legs to be pulled out of their sockets. This form of punishment was mostly used to extract confessions. Ball torture is another method also used for interrogations. The victim would be hung by the wrist with heavy metal balls attached to their feet. They would then be stretched until they were almost dead, and then would be revived by a doctor, only to be hung again for a few more hours. The last method is branding. It is used for humiliation and also for punishment of whatever crime was committed. Depending on the crime, there would be a different symbol or letter burned into the flesh. An S was placed on the cheek for runaway slaves, an A was placed on the breast or chest for adulterers, and so on. Though torture was painful, it was never meant to kill.